Okay, so good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us, both of those who are tuning in live and those listening later on the podcast or watching the recording for this very special members shiur. I'm very excited personally to introduce Rabbi Dr. Rafi Zarum, who may not need an introduction to many of you, but I'll give one for those who are not familiar. Rabbi Zarum is the Dean of LSJS and holder of the Rabbi Sachs Chair in Modern Jewish Thought. He's a leading educator, lecturer, and author. He earned his PhD in theoretical physics from King's College London and an MA in adult education. He was ordained by leading rabbis, including Rabbi Sachs, and he's known for his dynamic teaching and innovative programs. I should also say, I think Montefiore College as well, which is important to add as one of our supporters of the Chabura. So the title of today's talk is there evidence for the Bible's historicity? And I should say that this topic was sparked by a fascinating question in our chat group about the absence of archaeological findings for some key events or historical accounts in Tanakh. And I think in particular, the question may have been about even just the United Kingdom of Israel, Shaul, David HaMelech. We talk about it as if it happened, and that was sparked a very lively conversation. But ultimately, it boiled down to a fundamental question of, what genre is Tanakh? Is it a history book or something else entirely? And I think there is, the moment I had that question, we had an event in New York with Rabbi Zarum. So I thought there was no one better to tackle this question, and Rabbi Zarum explores this question in his book, Questioning Belief, Torah and Tradition in an Age of Doubt, which we'll post a link to that group of that book of Koren. I highly recommend it. And we're privileged to have him share his insights with us tonight. So with that, I'll pass it over, Rabbi. All yours. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Avi, and thanks for organising this, helping to organise this. Appreciate it. You've been a very good supporter, and I really value that. It's great to see all of you. I'm a huge fan of the Chabura and of Dweck and all that you're doing. And the most important thing that Avi you didn't mention about me is that my father was Temani, and so I have my mother was Ashkenazi, so I'm a kind of halfway type person. But my love of Tanakh and belief in the Rambam comes very much from my father, and that's a very important thing and part of my tradition. And is there anybody better than me? Yep. Josh Berman, many others could do this in many ways differently, but I'm going to tell you my understanding of it for tonight. And I think I'm going to aim to try and talk for 45 minutes and then have time for questions and so on. And I've kind of bitten off quite a lot here because there's two different questions in the title in terms of what genre is the Tanakh and also the historicity. But I think they overlap. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about a little bit about the assumptions that we make as religious people when we read the Torah, and then some aspects, therefore, of archaeology and of literary readings. And hopefully that will make sense the way I think about these things. I haven't given you all the sources for the things on my hand. I've got a little handout. I can send the sources, what it's all based on, but I just wanted to do it in a kind of more I wanted to do it in a way that allowed me to cover a lot of ground. So I didn't want to do lots and lots of papers. So let me go through the ideas and you'll see. So is there evidence for the Bible's historicity? So in other words, is there corroborating evidence outside of the Torah and the Tanakh that we know that it's true? And we'll discuss that in a few minutes. That's part of it. And also, what genre is Tanakh? What kind of thing is Tanakh? What kind of book is it? You've all had the conversation. Is it a science book? Is it a history book? Is it a book of law? So I want to kind of address that kind of issue. So here we go. So first things first is it's a sacred text. For us, it has a religious value. The text itself, I've got a picture of a kind of a few hundred-year-old Sephardi Torah up there. And it, as I said, it has its sacredness, and that makes it unique. And the way Professor James Kugel talks about it is are you studying Torah or are you studying the Pentateuch? So the Pentateuch is a Greek word, which means the first 5 books of the Bible. It's not making any claim about its historicity or its divinity. It's just a statement of what that text is, and that's what academics do. So academics study the Pentateuch, but religious Jews study Torah, and they're different things. And that's the challenge. between the two. So first of all, question obviously, was the Torah dictated to Moses, as religious people believe, or is it a composite text composed by multiple human authors? And that debate goes way back. As you know, Wellhausen was key to the approach of it being a composite text, and yet in the very early 20th century, but very soon after, you had scholars such as Cassuto, Jewish professor, chief rabbi of Italy, then came to Israel, professor at Hebrew University, who argued against Wellhausen's approach. And then in modern times, you have two Jews, Professor James Kugel, I've mentioned earlier, who even though does, when he's being religious, believe in the divinity of the Torah, when he's being academic, said they're two separate things, and you can't mix the two. And you have to study them separately. Whereas, as I said, Professor Joshua Berman from Bar-Ilan University argues, no, I can actually do both. There is a way of harmonizing the two. So this debate's gone on for a long period of time. Now, what I want to do, because it's very useful, is show you Kugel's assumptions, right, of when we read Torah. Kugel says, and I think he's right about this, there might be more, but minimally, there are 4 assumptions that a religious Jew makes when they're studying Torah. Number 1, that the Torah is perfect. Number 2, it's cryptic. Number 3, it's eternal. And number 4, it's divine. And he goes on, he writes about this in How to Read the Bible and other places as well, but let me explain. Number 1, perfection. The Torah doesn't have mistakes, right? So the academic reading of it, the biblical criticism would say, look, some mistakes have crept in. They're just wrong, and it needs to be corrected. You can tell it's a mistake because there's words that couldn't have been there for lots of reasons. So that's mistakes. Internal contradictions. You know, in Bereshit, it says that we will be enslaved for 400 years, and in Shemot, it says 430 years. There's lots of contradictions between different parts of the Torah and Tanakh, right? So why is that? That's because it's multiple writers. But the religious person says, no, there are no internal contradictions. I can explain them all. And also unnecessary words. Everything has important significance. A word that Kugel uses in other places is omnisignificance. Every word, every letter has significance. Torah's perfect. We can learn infinitely from it. That's one assumption. Second one is it's cryptic, meaning it's multi-layered levels of meaning, and it needs interpretation. It can't just be read simply. There might be a pashat, we'll get into that reading of it, but there's multiple levels of understanding, and it's cryptic. It's not meant to be read in simple, literal way. Number 3, which again is different to an academic approach. Academic says, no, the text is what it is. The third approach is it's got eternal relevance. So most ancient texts were written at the time for the people that were there. But because this is divine, it could be written for all time. So it was written at one time, but meant to be applicable for all time. And a God could do that because it could be relevant for all time. I'm going to do this for all future generations. And that's the eternal relevance. And the fourth one is divine, that every single word of it was spoken in prophecy to Moses or to Moses and Joshua, however you know, but it's all prophecy spoken directly. So those are the 4 assumptions that Kugel makes. Now that makes you think, as Kugel's approach anyway, is that you can't therefore study the approach from an academic point of view because they don't make these assumptions. They're different worlds. And that's what, in fact, Kugel argues. You're doing different things. But I would argue, following Berman and many others, that actually it's not the case. If you look carefully, even though I accept that what Kugel's saying, that I as a religious Jew make those 4 assumptions, I say now, but these do not have to limit a traditional scholar. Right. By the way, we talk about a professor or an academic versus a traditional scholar. Traditional scholar, like us, is a believer. So just because I've got these 4 assumptions, that doesn't limit the way I read Torah. It just frames my perspective. And in fact, I can learn all these issues and find ways of dealing with it. So I've got here, the 4 assumptions do not preclude the Torah scholar from exploring other approaches to the text. They just demand loyalty to the practice and teaching of the tradition. As long as you're loyal to Jewish practice and Jewish teaching, then you can read anything and see how you're going to interpret it. And in fact, that's what people have done for thousands of years. So I've got here B, with clever or extreme interpretation, as we'll see, the conclusions of studying the Pentateuch, in other words, the academic approach, could in various ways be deduced through Torah study. I can get to all of those 4 things, even with traditional Torah study and those issues. So for example, perfection. So if I take the academic approach of there are mistakes that have happened in the Torah that have crept in, that logically that must have happened, and therefore the text we have isn't necessarily the right text. Well, Perfection can be maintained when intentional imperfection is recognized. What do I mean? So the rabbis say, Ezra changed things. There's dots on certain letters. I can give you the Gemaras where Ezra, the Chazal argue certain things are different because, or the way the letters are written, or even actual words, and these crept in, and that's what the dots are for, to show you the bits that Ezra changed. Or there's a famous Gemara about when the rabbis translated the Torah into Greek, the Septuagint, that they changed certain words because they were misunderstood, right? And therefore, do we have the right text now? Or even mystical approaches that originally they're a mystical approach, and the Kabbalah then goes into it, although the Gemara does begin with this. The Torah is originally black fire and white fire, written before creation. And therefore, the Torah that we have, the printed Torah, the word Torah, might not be some kind of perfect mystical Torah in heaven. So once you take this Kabbalistic approach, perfection is maintained because, yes, there's the perfect mystical Torah in heaven, but it might not be the one that we have in our hands, right? We have to use the one that we do. We're consistent with it now because that's what we have. Doesn't mean it's not perfect. So what I'm saying is there's always ways of getting around that so that you can maintain the idea of perfection and yet still see that the text we have in front of us might have imperfections or mistakes that have creeped in. Next, cryptic nature. Okay. So the cryptic nature means that all the contradictions and the redundancy that academics find in the Torah, we say, well, there's meaning to those, right? We can explain that the contradictions is because there's multiple ways of reading and there's no redundancies, but actually they're for purposeful interpretation. And Joshua Berman famously shows how ancient texts, the style of them was to repeat things in different ways to make different points. And therefore, it's not surprising there's different versions of it. It doesn't make it any less true. That's just the way things were done. And by harmonizing, well, not harmonizing contradictions, but saying that each text was for different reasons, you deal with that. And same with redundancy, that actually it was different intentions every time. And therefore, you can still take that approach. Then the eternal relevance. Now, this is an interesting one because you'd say, wait a second, the text was in the past, can't possibly be for the future. But what you could argue is that the human experience, which is what the Torah is really about, hasn't really changed. And there's an eternal nature to human experience. And therefore, if you're an academic and you believe it was written by astute authors, or you're a progressive Jew and you believe it had some kind of inspiration, it was divinely inspired, but still there was human input, or you're more into the literal heavenly dictation, right? I shouldn't say traditionally, that should be, I should say practically, not tragically. It's practically indistinguishable between those three. Right? You can't really tell the difference between an astute author, divinely inspired, or a heavenly dictation. If you say that the astute author touched on the essential, eternal human experience, and therefore it's still relevant now. I mean, otherwise, it's like saying, you know, why do people in England still study Shakespeare 500 years later? Because he's touching on the human experience, and there's something eternally relevant about that. And even though it's written in a particular time, the relevance of it can still be eternal if you're touching on deep human experience, which the Torah is. So again, not a problem. The fourth one, and again, I'm mixing these a little bit about it's being divine, it's from God. So you'd think, therefore, you have to have a reverence for that. It's from God, we can't play with it. But actually, what's shocking is the sheer unbridled creativity of centuries of rabbinic interpretation, which is just incredible. Right, what the rabbis have done to the Torah, forget modern interpreters, just Talmudic and slightly after, never underestimate what they're willing to do. So just because it's from God, it doesn't lead to this kind of respect of don't touch or play with it. On the contrary, the rabbis had no problem with playing with it. You all know the levels of Pardes, the 4 levels, Peshat, Remes, Drush, Sod, of reading the Torah. But let me just give you 4 examples. Again, these are all based on Gemaras, of 5 examples of really radical interpretation, which is fascinating to me, right? So number 1, theoretically instructive. What do I mean? Some bits of the Torah, the rabbis say, never happened, but they are educationally value for us. For instance, the wayward and rebellious son, Ben Sora or Moreh, right, who you stoned to death. Quite a shocking, a morally shocking text. The Gemara says in Sanhedrin, Lo haya v'lo atid liot. It never happened and it never will happen. But lam nichtav, so why is it in the Torah? Durosh v'kabel schar. Read it and gain reward. Now, the next line, by the way, Rabbi Gamliel disagrees and says, no, it did happen, and the guy was stoned, and I sat on his grave. But let's leave him aside for a moment. This approach is radical. The rabbis go, not only did it never happen, it never could happen in the future. How dare they say that? But no. So what's the purpose of it? It's purely theoretical and it's just instructive. That's a very radical. Is that only on the Ben Sora or Moreh? Could that apply to other ones as well? There's no reason why it couldn't. So that's really unpacked things. Next one you're probably more familiar with. Divrei Torah Kloshon Bnei Adam. The Torah is in a language humans can understand. And therefore, it's written in the style of what happened in those times. That's why it's got agricultural scenarios. Now, the Gemara has a limited understanding of that phrase, but Maimonides goes wild with it and says, you know, the Torah is written in a way that humans would understand, and therefore everything about God is metaphorical, and it's a very wide interpretation once you say that. And then other commentators, medieval commentators, discuss what does it mean, Kloshon Bnei Adam? Which Adam? An intelligent Adam, or the Adam of the 13th century BCE, recent Hebrew slave from Egypt, now standing at Mount Sinai? In which case, it could be simplified for humans. And if it's simplified, for those humans, we might be smarter and therefore look at it differently. So humans of 13th century BCE had no idea about the Big Bang, had no idea about evolution and so on. So therefore, Genesis chapter 1 is written in a very simple way with the essential things they need to know. So it gets you out of a lot of things. Number 3, the Gemara says, Dibra Torah Lashon Havai. Parts of the Torah are intentionally hyperbolic, exaggerating, dramatic. When it says that the buildings in Israel that have to conquer were built into the heavens, Ad Hashamayim. So the Gemara goes, they weren't to the heavens, they were just really tall. It's an exaggeration. And therefore there's lots of exaggerations in the Torah. Maimonides says lots of text could be exaggerated. So once it's exaggerated, it might not be literal. How far does that go? And then finally, an example of being, hyperbolic. Number 4, this is interesting. Sometimes the rabbis interpret the exact opposite of what the Torah says. One example, there's a few, that Yehuda and Tamar, were never married ever again, were never stayed together. So Rashi interprets based on the Gemara, no, they stayed married, the reverse. Or when there was a prophecy in the camp, remember when the 70 prophets prophesied, right? They prophesied and didn't continue. It said they temporarily prophesied when Moshe was feeling alone, and Devarim in Bamidbar, in Balotcha, they temporarily prophesied, and they didn't continue. Right? But the Gemara then says, Ela me'ata kol gadol ve'asaf. No, from then on there's a great voice. And it never ended. Don't read Yosef, who didn't continue, but Asaf did not conclude. So it's literally the reverse. It was a limited prophecy. No, it never ended. And Rav Soloveitchik in Obikashta Misham, his book, uses this to argue that the bush is still burning, that God's voice is still emanating. So the rabbis literally take a verse. Not only do they interpret it differently, they literally interpret it in the exact reverse of what you would think it would mean. It's incredible, the freedom that they have and what they do with it. And number 5, non-literalness, the classic one. You're not allowed to take some verses of the Torah literally. It's against Jewish law. Example, ayin tachat ayin, an eye for an eye. The Gemara says, Lamdu shezeh nemar tachat leshalem mamonhu. It means, tachat means monetary compensation. And you are wrong to take it literally. That's immoral to take it literally. So just these 5 tools, and if you look carefully, because some would argue, well, these tools were only in certain cases. Yeah, but not just the case they give. Once you have these tools in your tool belt, you can do a lot of playing with Torah and get very near, I'd say, as far as the biblical critics did in terms of the way they played with Torah. So actually, a traditional loyal Jew reading Torah has done just as much creative reading as biblical critics and more. And that's interesting about it. So in terms of understanding what kind of genre it is, the rabbis didn't feel bound by seeing it as a particular genre, like a holy genre that I can't play with, or a historical one, right, or a scientific one. They said, no, we have infinite ability to interpret as long as we're loyal to our tradition. And that's what they did. So therefore, just continuing this, there are now modern methods of biblical study, which are post-biblical criticism, which have brought the Pentateuch, academic reading, and the Torah, traditional reading, closer in some ways and further apart in others. And this is the last 100 years since biblical criticism. How has it brought it closer? Archaeology. Not all archaeology. Some archaeology contradicts, but we can discuss that. So, for instance, were camels domesticated or were there wells? We can get into that, but there's a lot of archaeology that supports, that can support a lot of later parts of the Bible. And we're going to get into that a little bit now. And then literary readings as well, a literary approach to the Torah, right? Where the literary scholars got their hands on the Torah and saw much greater unity and consistency than biblical critics ever did. So in some ways, modern scholarship since biblical criticism has brought the Pentateuch and the Torah closer together. In other ways, they've brought it further apart. Why? Because there are other ancient texts like Gilgamesh, the alternatives of stories of the floods. You'll say, well, ours is not original. Again, there's ways of dealing with that, but you could bring it further away. Or science, right? Scientifically, people believed 200 years ago miracles could happen. Now scientists say they couldn't happen, right? So the flood story, yes, you could say it's a miracle, but then why would the Torah put the world back together again to look as if it never happened? So these things challenge people today. But again, some things bring us closer. So that moves me on now. So that's just an introduction to what kind of genre it is. And now that moves me on to looking at archaeological things and then a bit of literary criticism. I'm just going a little bit. These are huge subjects, but I'm introducing you to them to see. So the first page is that the more I studied this, the more I saw how radical the rabbis were and that they felt that they could play and read the text in so many ways that actually loyalty doesn't mean that I have to be ignoring of any other kinds of reading. And actually, we've got a great, very proud tradition. So that's number one. Number two, let's do a bit of archaeology. And this I do when I take people around the British Museum and I show them objects that I think everyone should see. And why? Because these are examples of the oldest of something. So in other words, how far back can we go? How far back is there corroborating evidence of the Torah from outside of the Torah? Now, we've got things that could suggest stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, based on what we knew about the nomads of that time. We've got things that suggest the truth of the Exodus, as I write in my book. But in terms of actual corroborating evidence, so you could put hand on heart that any academic would say, this event actually happened. What do we have? What's the oldest stuff? So what I argue, there are three parts of the argument. The oldest character, the oldest event, and the oldest picture. So those are the three I'm going to go for now, to my understanding. So I'd argue, what's the oldest character? What's that's mentioned in Tanakh that I know definitely existed? So let's go from the other end. Let's go from the end of Tanakh, right? So from the end of Tanakh, when we're getting to the destruction of the first temple, right? 586 BCE, 6th century BCE, we know that happened. We've got Assyrian and Babylonian texts to confirm that happened. There's a wonderful book I can show you, Kogan, where he collects all the Babylonian and Assyrian texts that are relevant to Bible, and we know that happened. So we know the first temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. And we know Chizkiyahu existed. There's corroborating evidence about Chizkiyahu. So that's 7th century BCE, right? But we can go back earlier. To my understanding, the oldest character that we know existed is Achav. So Achav, as you know, mentioned here, is mentioned in the first book of Kings, chapter 16. We know about him. His reign is mentioned there. And we separately have something called the Kirk monolith. You can see this in room 4 of the British Museum. And it's a text written in Akkadian. And it's a stone which tells the story of the battle of King Shalmaneser of Assyria with, I think, 11 local kings. So, the Assyrians every summer would go west to get to the coast. Assyria wanted to conquer all the way to the coast. This would be where modern Syria is today. So they could take over the ports and trade with the whole Mediterranean basin. But it took them a long time to get there. This is the Neo-Assyrian Empire. There was an earlier Assyrian Empire, but that had collapsed. So this is the Neo-Assyrian in 9th century BCE. We know this because of these stones. And Shalmaneser, he writes on this stone, he reaches the coast and then goes south, and he's about to conquer Israel, and 11 kings fight against him and push him back. And this battle happened in Karkar in 853 BCE. It's amazing, 9th century BCE. And it mentions in the text that one of the kings was Ahabu Sur Ilia, which everyone agrees, every archaeologist agrees, is Ahab, king of Israel. Okay? The Baal-worshipping son of Omri. Everyone agrees that's Ahab. Now, is that battle mentioned in Tanakh? No. Okay, but then that's not an issue because the Tanakh, if you've read the book of Kings, you'll know every time it mentions a story about a king, it mentions at the end and says, and there's many more stories that happen to this king, which are written in Sifrei Malchei Yehuda v'Shomron, written in the books of the kings over Judah and Samaria. These are other books we don't have. But if it didn't happen in the land of Israel and has no religious significance, then Tanakh says, I'm not going to mention it. So so the Tanakh doesn't corroborate the event, but it corroborates the character. So here's the thing to understand, right? So there is no text that says Avraham, and we know that's our Avraham. But here there's a text that says Achav, and that's our Achav. Everyone agrees. Now you might say to me, what about the Dan Steeler? This is that mentions Bet David. There is something that's slightly older, 10th century BCE, so up to 100 years earlier, which mentions Bet David, the house of David, from later kings. And some argue that that is an older text. That could be. I actually think that it is, but archaeologists aren't all convinced because of the text and the way it's written. So some will go for that one. Even some very anti-religious people believe in that one. But this one, I know for a fact, definitely everyone agrees that this happened. And therefore, the King Ahab mentioned in the middle of the Bible definitely existed. Now, that's useful to know as an academic, to be able to say to someone that the archaeology, we can go back that old. That's an incredible thing. Right, I'll move on. Next thing, what's the oldest event the Bible talks about that there's corroborating evidence? So the fact Ahab existed, we've corroborated, but what about an event? So that is the battle, a battle that happens in Moab, the war with Jehoram, which is described in the second book of Kings, which again Ahab is involved in. And there is a stone called the Moabite stone, which was found in 1868, which tells the same story. Now, unfortunately, the stone was actually drawn at the time, and then someone smashed the damn thing. Well, they've pieced it back together again, and it's in the Louvre. But I believe that that's a real stone, and it tells the same story as the Bible describes in Melachim Bet. So it's slightly later than the first event, but it's another one. So I've got the oldest character and now the oldest story. Again, 9th century BCE, which is incredible. The third one is the black, which stands, by the way. So that's in the Louvre, the Moabite stone, but the Kirk monolith that I mentioned with Achav's name, and this third one, the black obelisk, are both in the British Museum, just 2 meters apart. And this one is an obelisk that tells Shalmaneser, discovered in 1846, and it shows you can see it over here, I'll enlarge it a bit, a person who everyone agrees is a Jew, bowing down to Shalmaneser the third, and underneath is written in Akkadian, Mahadatu Samyamu Ma Mihumri, which means tribute of Yehu, son of Omri, right? And Yehu, as you all know, was a king of Israel, who's mentioned in Melachim Bet as well in chapter 9. And he pays tribute to Shalmaneser, which we know is the case. And this is a picture of this happening. Right now, by the way, he wasn't the son of Omri. He was actually against Omri. The reasons for that we can get into, but something else. But this picture is of a Jew, right, or a Hebrew, Israelite, kneeling down. And every archaeologist says that is the Yehu in the Bible. So this is the oldest picture of an Israelite in the world. And again, 9th century. So oldest picture, oldest event, and oldest character are all 9th century BCE. What's the significance of that? Well, let me quote from my book. Such objects have left no doubt in the mind of archaeologists regarding the existence of the northern kingdom of Israel, as well as specific Israelite kings as far back as 9th century BCE. To me, this is staggering. It means that we can confidently trace our people back in time by more than 2,850 years. This is centuries before the empires of Persia and Greece, and well before the birth of Christianity and Islam. We predate Confucius and Socrates, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. Even if you find belief in God difficult, you can be sure that the Bible contains verified ancient stories of our ancestors and their culture, which stretch far back into antiquity. So the point I'm trying to make here is that once you start the archaeology, you don't realize how much it tells us. You know, I've taken hundreds, maybe even thousands of people on these tours of the British Museum, and even those who don't believe in God are skeptical about things, and I respect their skepticism. They can't believe that this stuff goes that far back. It's an incredible thing. And so, as I said, archaeology gives a lot of truth to the Torah, the second half of the Torah, the Bible rather, not the Torah, the Tanakh, in ways that is really surprising. So archaeology really helps. Now, there are problems with the archaeological stuff, as I mentioned earlier. domestication of camels. Right, all the stories of Abraham and camels that go on in Bereshit. Archaeologists have argued that camels were not domesticated by that time. Josh Berman has written a response to that. You can read it. Also, caves. I went to a wonderful lecture about wells, rather, the ancient wells, and the Rivka, the kind of well that's described in Torah, did not happen at that time. Again, there are responses to those issues. So there are archaeological problems. Absolutely, I'm not denying those. And you have to study and try and make sense. But most of them can be, there's room for unclear. Just Josh Berman's point about the camels, which is that there are traces of earlier domestication. It just wasn't standard, but it's always possible, right, for individuals to have done it. And therefore, it's possible. And you can't prove by lack of knowledge of something. So it's open to possibility. It's not proof, but it's possible. And that's an issue. So archaeology is very helpful for us to understand the historicity of the Torah. And just because you read it as a religious person and you believe that it's true, it's from God, it's reassuring to know that it doesn't clash with the historical things that we know. That's just reassuring. I mean, you know, a religious person will go, well, obviously, right? But it's reassuring people with questions to know that. So that's one aspect on archaeology. There's a lot more to the subject. There's huge books on it. Just unshare for a moment. Right, so these wonderful books are on the topic. There's this Lost Treasures of the Bible, Understanding the Bible through archaeological artifacts in world museums. Lots of examples of those things, or Digging the Bible, and just the British Museum published his own book, Interpreting the Evidence. They've got, and these are books published by the British Museum, not by religious people, and they show lots of corroborating evidence of the Bible. So archaeology, I think, is more helpful than not. And I've seen that even in the ultra-Orthodox world now, they are bringing in selective archaeological evidence. And if you go to Israel, you see the most amazing things there that bring Tanakh to life. So I think archaeology is a very rich approach that should be done. Now, a little bit more complicated on literary readings, and this is a huge topic as well. So I'm just going to show you some of the things that excite me. So as you know, Robert Alter, who's actually still alive, he's in his 80s now, maybe even 90s, a brilliant biblical scholar, was actually a literary scholar who then started taking his literary approaches and applying them to the Bible, to the Torah, and famously The Art of Biblical Narrative back in the, wait, I'll quote that over here. Yeah, back in the 80s, this first book is fascinating. It's a beautiful read because every idea he brings in, he then gives you every chapter where he brings another literary style to the Torah or explains how it works. He gives you an example and reads it beautifully. And the assumption of literary readers is that the Bible, the Torah, it might have been composite writers, but it's treated as a whole. And it's been put together as a whole, and you can read it as a whole. And all these apparent redundancies or contradictions actually have meaning, and they're fascinating. And again, I wanted to write much more about this in the notes for you now, but I really didn't have time, so I've just done some here. So one example he gives is that, you know, this assumption of biblical critics that you have to read it literally, right? Whereas we read it cryptically. So he now makes an argument that it's impossible to read a Bible text literally. Look what he says. He says a rigorously strict construction of literal interpretation is bound to turn into an impossibility. Right? He says it straight out. Every attempt, that is, to reduce the text to a kind of 0 degree of meaning, it just means this, where the textual details mean nothing but itself, finally collapses, because given the pull of co-texts, other version, and the allure of metaphor, it's always theoretically possible to conceive meanings beyond the 0 degree. He says you can't just literally and ignore, because there's noise of other ways of reading it, of other texts that are similar or metaphors that the human mind wants to do. And since we're made in the image of God from a religious point of view, how can we not read metaphor in? So he says that simplistic literal reading is just inappropriate. Now you might say, but doesn't what Alter say contradict what the Bible, what the rabbis say? Right? A Gemara, Alter's approach seems to clash with the rabbinic principle of Ein Mikra Yodeh Mipnei Pshuto. A biblical text never abandons its plain meaning. That's a line from the Gemara. But if you look at it, the Gemara mentions that 3 times, right? If you look at that phrase, it only appears 3 times in Talmud. 2 are actually end up rejecting the plain meaning, right? And neither fits in the larger interpretation of the text. So the Gemara brings that phrase and then rejects it twice. And the 3rd time when it does, it also gives metaphorical meaning. So, and even if you say that line should be taken as an important phrase, the plain meaning, right, is not the same as the literal meaning necessarily, and therefore it doesn't have to contradict Alter at all. And Alter says in the ultimate biblical narrative, he says the literary project of the Bible was to seek, through the process of narrative realization, to reveal the enactments of God's purpose in historical events. So this is a very complicated phrase, and you have to read Alter a lot. But basically, he asks the question is, if it's divine, now he doesn't think it's divine, he thinks it's multiple readers, but he says, but why, if it would be seen as divine, would it have literary merit? Why would that be the case? And he says, because it's told, and this is a bit similar to it's written for humans to understand, through the process of a narrative story, which allows literary readings, it reveals the enactments of God's purpose in historical events. So it's not a historical text, it's got God's purpose, but it's enacted through history and therefore tells it through narrative. And once you have the word narrative, literary critics are all excited. We understand narrative. So in that sense, the genre of Torah is narrative, but that just means it's a story. Well, it's obviously a story. Anybody who reads it can tell it's a story. But the story is not about historicity. It's about God's purpose embedded in history. But it's embedded in real history. That's important as well, right? The places it mentions are places on Earth, not Middle Earth, right? The places are mentioned in the Middle East, not in Narnia. They're real. The intention of the writer, or writers if you're Robert Alter, is that it took place on Earth. But it's not interested in telling you a historical story. It's interested in God's purposes. But they're enacted through history, through the text of narrative. So when you read Alter, even though he clearly doesn't believe in the divinity of the Torah, as a religious person, he's explained so many issues that biblical criticism made it hard for you to think about, right? And as I said, literary readings bring you much closer to a traditional reading of Torah as opposed to Pentateuch. Another approach, again, is the difference between the Torah and the later Greek writers. And there's a famous essay by Eric Auerbach in his book Mimesis, chapter 1, where he compares the way the ancient Greeks wrote, right? And we're talking, 5th century BC and the Torah. And this is important because biblical critics try and argue the Torah is written quite late, around the time of the Greeks. And yet Auerbach says the Torah is fundamentally different in its interests, in the way it's written. The style of the narrative is very different. It's a great essay to read. You can get it online. But I've just got one paragraph where Auerbach says the following. It is all very different. He talks about the Greeks writing, the Greek, Odysseus and so on, and the Iliad and so on. And he says it's all very different in biblical stories. Their aim is not to bewitch the senses. And if nevertheless they produce lively sensory effects, it's only because the moral, religious, and psychological phenomena, which are the Torah's sole concern, are made concrete in the sensible matter of life. Right, it's just one paragraph, an amazing essay where he shows how different the Greeks talk about the food and the lusciousness and the desire, and the Torah doesn't. The Torah, and again, I've missed all this out because of time. The Torah, according to Alter, is much more about story and dialogue. Right, there's a lot of dialogue and much less description in the Torah, and that's very important. Finally, I know, 2 more quotes and then we're done. Yeah. Michael Fishbane, another brilliant writer in his biblical Text and Texture, where he shows that the Exodus story is mentioned all over Tanakh, loads and loads of times in different Sfarim. We retell the story of the Exodus in different kinds of ways. And in the question of did the Exodus happen, is it literal? His answer is brilliant. He's not a believer in the divinity of the Torah, but he still explains the genre of it. So Fishbane says the Exodus is a literary construct fusing saga and history. What does that mean? History, you know what history is, right? Things that happened. But what is saga? So he explains. The Exodus from Egypt was experienced as an event of divine redemption. I love the way he says experienced. They saw it as that. So you and I might say it was that, but he says either way, the people saw it as that. During which ancient promises were realized, promise to Abraham, and divine power confirmed, 10 plagues, splitting of the sea. The transformative nature of this event in the lives of the ancient Israelites affected its recollection and literary formulation. This was such a powerful thing. It affected how they remembered it and how it got written about. For those who experienced it, no simple chronological report would do justice to the wonder of the divine intervention in the historical lives. They couldn't just write down what happened. It was miraculous. So he says only the saga form would do, focusing selectively on specific events and people, endowing the encounters between the principal actors with a paradigmatic cast, so it's Moses versus Pharaoh, no other major characters, and infusing historical process with the wonder of supernatural events. So they told it in this miraculous way. It's an amazing statement he's making here, because a religious Jew can go, oh, I see, it really happened and they described it in this way. Or an academic will go, well, it didn't really happen, but they described it in this way. But you end up in the same place. It's an amazing thing when you read Fishbane and you realize what he's really saying. And therefore, finally, and with that now I'll open to questions, I quote from Rabbi Sachs in his early books, which to my mind were in some ways much more radical than the later stuff. And he says, and so now he's talking about the Talmud right here, but he's talking about how the rabbis ask questions about the Bible. So really he is talking about Tanakh. Rabbi Sachs writes, when the sages of the Talmud ask, why was this verse written? Or why was this passage placed next to that? Right? He's talking about Torah. When they ask those questions, their typical answer is not because that is how it happened. In other words, they're not interested in history. That's not what happened. Right? Why does it say that Pharaoh had his birthday? That's not just what happened. Or why is it written like that? Right? It's not just because that's happened, but to teach you that. In other words, every nuance of the text is searched not for its correspondence with empirical actuality. That's a very clever way of saying, not because we're interested in if it's true or not. That's literally what he means. Right? Empirical actuality is empirical measurement. I can detect it. So we're literally not interested if it actually happened or not. So do I have to believe that it did? Well, the rabbis don't care. So if you want to believe in it, you can. If you don't want to, you don't have to. But that's not what the rabbinic project was. That's what he's writing. It's a very radical thing, and he writes it in this beautiful language. So it's to my mind, following Maimonides' approach, slightly hidden. But he says every nuance of the text is searched not for its correspondence with empirical actuality. It might be true. Maimonides, by the way, says in the guide, sometimes you must. It's good to believe it's true. Sometimes it's dangerous. But either way, it's not written for that. It's written for its halakhic or moral. So halakhic is direct, practical, and more principled implications. He says, for the sages, this is Sachs in 1992, for the sages, Torah is not an assemblage of facts, but a series of rules and models of how Israel should live and thereby be sanctified. That is its genre and proper mode of interpretation, which brings us right back to Kugel, how he began. There we go. So that's 45 minutes, pretty much. I'll take questions and discussions. That's hopefully helpful. I hope I didn't go too fast. I hope it made sense what I was doing. This is how I look at it. Over to you, Avi, to manage.
Oh, very much so. Thank you so much. Absolutely fascinating. And really, this is a taster for, I think it should be a series. Each of these quotes and each section really we could go on and on. So I'll ask maybe if people wanna, you can write in the chat or you can raise your hand and I'll come to you. Well, Ruben, since you're here, please, all yours. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Rabbi Zarum, again for speaking with us. Always very lot of thought to be thought about. I guess my question is: you mentioned this model of rabbinic interpretation as a to work with the academic works. I'm just curious because the way since I've been taught, rabbinic interpretation is less about it being interpretive, but rather being an element of Torah Sheba'al Peh. And so what they would say, Rashi brings in this description as interpretation, but other people might argue this is actually the ultimate higher level of divine truth. Obviously, there's some flaw in that because there's contradictions in rabbinic interpretation. So how do you draw the line between what you can be considered another layer of divine truth of Torah Sheba'al Peh and actual rabbinic, unique interpretation?
Well, it's a very amorphous issue, the idea of Torah Sheba'al Peh being somehow divine, right? Because the only people, I'll say this slightly facetiously, the only people who believe that every word of the Talmud was given to Moses at Mount Sinai are people who haven't read the Talmud. Because the minute you read it, it's just obviously not. It's something else. What they mean is, in some kind of general sense, Moshe was taught, and the Gemara says this, he was shown a vision of the menorah. He was shown what tefillin were, so he knew what they were. There was some kind of oral process that went down with him, so he understood what it meant. That's the point that they talk about. But then the Gemara says very clearly, the minute Moses died, thousands of laws were forgotten. So that tradition got lost along the way. The Talmud does not capture all of it. How do I know? There are two Talmuds, the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, and there are Tosefta and things that aren't part of it. There's lots of rabbinic literature we found. So even if we say there is and I believe there is an oral law that was passed down, the Talmud is not the whole sum of it. We have lots of it missed, right? And therefore there's lots of room for interpretation. So the principle stands, we believe in it, but it doesn't limit our ability to interpret in any way practically whatsoever. Does that make sense? Right,
I think so. I guess the question is, the only thing it's confusing to me a little bit is that they would still say that some of the claims that are made in rabbinic commentary, like for example, Rashi, people would make the claim that his interpretation, or is actually has lineage back to the direct historical path of Moshe, even though.
But Ruben, the standard Torah that you learn from, a Mikrot Gedolot, as you know, which has got the text and Rashi and other commentaries around, the commentaries on the page unashamedly go, Ibn Ezra, Ramban, Rashi's wrong. So, if you want to hold that point of view, you have to ignore the medieval commentators who didn't clearly think in that way. So they were all saying there is some kind of divine oral law, but Rashi might have not got it completely right. So I'm going to argue with him to find out what it is.
Yes.
So the minute you read your traditional Jewish learning, you don't think everything Rashi says is definitely divine authority. You can't, because the Ramban doesn't and the Ibn Ezra doesn't.
So they would kind of look at that maybe potentially as like traditional confusion along the way, not Rashi's personal interpretation. Is that like
true? But at that point, it's all in the air then, because of course Rashi knew, but we misunderstood. Do you know what I mean? It just goes out the window. Have you got time?
Just to clarify, I am more on your side. I just curious.
There's a great. If we have time at the very end, and Avi will decide, I'll tell you a story that's actually in Tradition magazine, written by Eliezer Berkovitz, which really helps on this issue, which you might like. But I haven't got time now. Let's do more questions, and we'll come back.
Okay.
Thank you,
Akiva, and then we'll have Dylan afterwards.
Thank you, Rabbi Zarum. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. A lot of these conversations we've had, me and Avi also. Spread this on. So I'm happy this is happening. What I'm sort of wondering, based on everything you said, is that kind of the common denominator is that there's room for flexibility.
Yeah.
But there are certain things that seem to have more indications of historical, let's say, accuracy, and some things that are clearly taken more to let's say the interpretive side. So for the most part, people generally in this sphere tend to say the Adam and Eve story is almost entirely symbolic, or at least the understanding of it is very, very up to interpretation, as opposed to King Achav, who seems to have a real historical figure in place there. And I was wondering where is it that we should draw the line? Is it based on what more we find in archaeology? Where is it around Noah? Is it around Moshe? Is it around Abraham? Where is it that the line is drawn from, a real, actual just symbolism, which seems to be in the Adam and Chava story, and then the actual historical reality of King Achav? Because let's say the Rambam, he seems to be saying in his Ikarim that Moshe received the Torah and he was the greatest prophet there ever was. But what does that even mean? Is it more towards the side of the symbolism of the Genesis story, or the historicity of the Achav story? Where do we draw that line?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot I could talk about. I'll be very, very brief. Number one, when do you take things literally, when do you not? So Sajja Gaon in his Sefer Emunot V'Deot, I think 9th century, tried to write rules of when you take things literally and when you don't, which is interesting. So there were understanding of that issue. And the more you understand the genre, the more you understand when it's being literal and when it's not being literal. In terms of what you said about the Rambam, that line I gave about Lashon Havai, let me see if I can share with you, because I have another sheet which I didn't add on in the end. but I've got a bit in the Rambam here. Yeah, let's see if we can share just for a moment. Share. This is the Rambam in the Moed Nevuchim, when he's analyzing that Gemara, Torah Lashon Havai, right? And he says, he gives examples of things not being literal, and he says, I'll do it in English, you must explain passages not quoted by me, by those which I've quoted in this chapter. He says, I'm going to give you a few examples, but any passage you can use my approach. Employ your reason, and you will be able to discern what is said allegorically, figuratively, or hyperbolically, and what is meant literally, exactly according to the primary meaning of the texts. Right? It says, if you read my text, and you'll get the hang of when to take it literally and when not to take it literally. It's an amazing statement because he opens it up to the possibility that everything of the whole Torah is not literal, as long as you know how to read from what he's taught you how to do it. And just a final point is, every ancient literature, Akiva, this is what I discovered when I researched it, starts off in symbolic or non-literal or mythic and moves into history. So Beowulf, the ancient texts that were done there, starts off, it's got dragons in it. It's also got kings, right? Or King Arthur, sword in the stone. King Arthur's a real king, but I don't think Merlin's true, right? Battle of Troy. I don't think it began with goddesses arguing about who's most beautiful, but Troy did have a battle. So the more you learn about ancient history, all civilizations start off on a kind of mythic period, which gradually moves into a historic period. And many have argued, and you could even argue it medievally if you follow Rabbi Bachia, that the first 11 chapters of the Torah are more in this mythic, symbolic sense as you're describing. And if you look at the last word, the last letter of the last word of chapter 11, B'charan, it's a large nun. And Rabbi Bachia explains there, because that's kind of a gap of a different period of Jewish history, right? Of a kind of more mythical, non-literal, and it kind of moves in from Genesis 12. There's lots of other approaches to that, but that's just examples of things that I found, because your question has fascinated me for decades. I hope that's helpful.
Fascinating. Just sorry, it was one really quick follow-up. Sorry, Avi. Would you say that according to that approach of the Rambam, it's possible that, by virtue of a general approach of, faith in the scientific process, and faith in scientific process, that even things that he might have not personally agreed upon, by virtue of more recent archaeological findings, he would say, run with my philosophy. Like I might have believed Moshe was a real person.
I think that's pretty clear.
And you wouldn't think that.
Yeah. There's a famous story of when they landed on the moon, because Maimonides believed that the planets were eternal and therefore had a consciousness. And when the man landed on the moon, right, in 69, who was it? Some big Rav in America said the Rambam would have cried because he found out he was wrong about that bit of it. His structure still works. We can get into that, but he was wrong about certain things. And he would have said, fine, find more information. The way you know these things is the Ramban, when he goes to live in Israel, gets all excited when he finds some coins and historical artifacts. He wants to read and learn about it. So Maimonides would be so excited about the science of today. He would love it, and he would reinterpret and develop. You get that feeling from reading the Rambam. You really do. I can't say for sure. He wouldn't necessarily agree to every interpretation, but he would definitely not ignore it. When he talks about the Sabaeans that he would find and so on. So, he argued that every kind of idolatry would end up being found in the Torah, that the Torah bans is because of some idolatry of the time. So he's begging you to study archaeology, Akiva. He's telling you, the more you could find, the better. And he gives books examples that he found. We've now found loads more books. I do a tour of the British Museum looking at all the 51 kinds of idolatry that Maimonides lists in his Mishnah Torah, and associating with different idolatry in India and in Africa and in Mexico and in Asia. It's great fun. There you go.
Wow. Sounds like I need to visit, and that sounds like I need to visit the British Museum.
Yes, you do. We all do.
Maybe do you do virtual tours, Rabbi?
I actually have, but
Really?
they're better in person. Yeah.
Okay.
Seeing is believing, Avi. Seeing is believing.
Okay, wonderful. Dylan, do you still have a question? We'd love to hear from you.
Maybe something short. Thank you as always, Avi and Rabbi Zarum. Excellent as always. Akiva asked the main thing I had in mind, but I was wondering in the couple of minutes we have left, if you can go a little more into what we were talking about in terms of Peshat. And you touched on very briefly a very interesting idea that even if we accept that the Makra doesn't go from its meaning in Peshat, that maybe it doesn't necessarily mean a literal thing. And this is something that seems to come up quite a bit on the groups. The concept of Peshat is not necessarily meaning literal, but maybe something slightly different to that. So if you can expand on that, it would be very much appreciated.
Yeah, because that comes up the question of Peshat means, because, you know, when you're doing a remez or a drush, you could be comparing to another text and doing interpretation which is beyond the basic one. But the basic one doesn't mean literal reading. It means the normal genre of how this text is written. But that requires understanding what the genre is. And that's, I think, the best way of understanding that is literary readings, because they understand the genre of text. So, for instance, I mentioned it earlier, so I'll go into it slightly more as you wanted. Alter talks about that the Torah is a narrative, mainly narrative through dialogue. There's an incredible amount of dialogue in the Torah, right? Once you get to the legal parts, it's even then the legal parts always begin with Vayomer Vaydaber Hashem Moshe Lemor. God spoke to Moses saying, why would it be the case that it's all through speech? There's the narrator themselves hardly exists in the Torah. Now you get that feeling from reading Torah, then you know how to read a text. And also the first time then a character speaks turns out to be really important. So once you've understood that, then if you say this verse is significant because the character says something and the peshat therefore is that he cares about this, well, I know that because every time a character speaks, it's important. So the more you get a feel for the kind of text, the more you understand how to read it. And therefore that's its basic meaning. That's what it meant. So you have to understand how to read. Does that make sense? It's like, and well, you know, well, I don't want to get into the whole other thing because it's the whole other next level of it. But that's the basic point that I'm making. The peshat, I would argue that the literary readings have got nearer to peshat than anything before. And the reason I feel that, by the way, is Chazal often did literary readings of it when they explain it. And so that's why I feel that. And also, by the way, Chazal don't often distinguish between Peshat and Drush. If you read Midrashim, some of them are literally explaining what the word means, and some of them are kind of more of a kind of fantastical, and some of them are really wild, and they move seamlessly between them. So this line of Peshat, which is only a couple of lines in the Gemara that I mentioned earlier, and is always argued against, actually isn't that important. Later on, some people have put frameworks on of, you know, the word pardes of Peshat Midrash Sod is not even in the Gemara. That's later. So I even argue that that's actually not that important. And so exactly knowing what does Peshat mean, I would argue Peshat is a post-Talmudic framing of how to read biblical text, which itself is a drush on how to read the text. And therefore, I don't feel that subservient to it, if that makes sense.
100%, that's perfect. I mean, one of the things I heard before was that it's sort of the commonly accepted sense, which fits very nicely with the idea of literary readings in terms of that. So yeah, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Good. It's good to hear you, Dylan, if not see you, but it's good to see you. It's good to hear you.
So we have a few minutes, and you mentioned the Berkovitz article.
Oh yes, you like that? So again, I've got to find it because I read it over Shabbat once, and I was in a synagogue and I was reading from tradition. I can't remember which tradition it was, but you've all heard of Professor Eliezer Berkovitz, a brilliant scholar from last century, and he's writing about his teacher, the Sridei Eish, and about who told him this story about the Yache Kala, which was these big conferences that used to go on. I'm not sure if in Poland or wherever, where all these scholars would get together for like a summer to learn Torah and Talmud and so on. And the story goes that it had a slightly, it might have been actually about the Sridei Eish himself. Yeah, he's reading, he's explaining a halachic text, and there's a Rashi on the Torah. And the Sridei Eish says, you know, this Rashi here doesn't make sense. And the reason why is it's a printing error. It's very clearly a printing error. And the Sridei Eish, Yechiel Weinberg, brings in, I think the story goes that he brings in different versions that we have of the Rashi, right, from our you know, manuscripts, and shows that it was a typo in the printers, and therefore you can ignore that bit, and then the Rashi makes more sense, and everything's fine interpreted that way. So that's what happens in this lecture. But the Bochum who are sitting there are a bit devious. So what do? They go to one of these Hasidic rabbis, and they ask him the same question. They go, "What do you think this Rashi means?" Right? And this Hasidic Rebbe gives this whole brilliant interpretation of how Rashi was actually right, and that everything he said was 100% right, and so on. right? So what happens? The Bochum, being naughty, go back to the Srili Esh and say, oh, that Rav said it actually means this. So the story goes, the Berkowitz writes, that night at dinner, the Srili Esh goes up to this Hasidic Rebbe and says to him, please God, Admer Vesrim, you and I are both going to go to Shamayim. And who's going to meet me in Shamayim? It's going to be Rashi. Rashi's going to say to me, Rav Weinberg, the printers made mistakes in my text and they miswrote what I intended, and you noticed it and you explained what I really meant, and thank you so much. And then the Srili said to the Hasidic Rebbe, and who's going to go up to you in Shamayim? The printers. And they're going to say, Rebbe, all these people said that we made mistakes and that we had typos and that we mucked things up, and you justified every single thing that we did. And then the Srili turns to the Rav and goes, who do you want to meet you in Shamayim? Rashi or the printers? It's a great story. I hope you followed the point that was being made. It's a brilliant story. I don't know if it's true, and I can't find it. I'm sure one of you out there will find it in tradition. And I might have made mistakes along the way. I read it about maybe 15, 20 years ago. So I've been looking for it ever since. But if someone finds it, I'll love to see it. But it's an amazing story because in a way, it's like, if there are typos in the commentaries, when you go to Shamayim, do you want Rashi to meet you and say, thank you for trying to correct it? Or do you want the printers, who aren't as Gedolim as Rashi? So it's a great story. So I hope that's a nice way to end our...
Thank you. Yeah, we better get the real story. We want to meet the Srili Esh.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Zarum, and really, really appreciated this. It was really enjoyable, but also just so informative. We look forward to having you again.
My pleasure. And what the Chabura is doing, the advancement of Sephardi learning, but the open way it learns all kinds of Torah and yet deep commitment to our tradition. It's really it's a model really for the world. And it should Yagdil Torah, it should grow in multiple ways. And anywhere I can support the Chabura, I want to. It's a wonderful thing, really.
Man, thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you everyone for joining. And we look forward to seeing you in the next one. Have a wonderful day. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks so much. Good night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.